Well, welcome to our conversation about Jesus Makes It Real. That's chapter 26 in Brian McLaren's book, We Make the Road by Walking. And it was the subject of our sermon today. I'm Reverend Lance from First Congregational United Church of Christ in Alpena. Across from me is the minister who for 20 years was in the same pulpit, Reverend Bob Case. This morning he was preaching in Atlanta, Michigan at a different church on a different topic altogether. So we're grateful that he made it all the way back to Alpena. And the pulpit that he was in Atlanta for the past 10 years was Ginny Titus's pastorate. So Reverend Ginny Titus is with us as well. And so we're going to be talking about the question, how does Jesus make things real? Jesus makes it real. Well, today I tried to point out that the it we're talking about is God's kingdom, the presence of God, God's realm, God's rule, God's will being done on earth. Jesus makes it real. It's not just in your head, it's not just in theory, it's a reality. The primary story that's in that chapter is a retelling of when Jesus was in a crowded house and some people wanted to bring a paralyzed man to him, could not make their way through the crowd. So instead, 4 of his friends went up on the roof, ripped a hole in the roof, and then lowered the man down in the middle of the congregation, in the middle of the Bible study, in the middle of the gathering. In Brian McLaren's treatment of that particular chapter, there's very little about that incident, which seems to be a really bizarre, bold thing to do. My sermon carried a lot more content about that. But what he does point to, he had Mary Magdalene as a character take us aside and explain to us what she thinks is going on inside that house. So that's really how the chapter went. And I'm going to begin first by just pointing out that this is part of her telling of it. They said, well, what kind of a kingdom? Is he a rebel? Is this a revolution? What is it he's doing? And she says, his kingdom is not like the regimes of this world, who take up daggers and swords and spears, who make laws, who demand taxes. No. Jesus heals the sick, teaches the unschooled, and inspires the downtrodden with hope. So no, I would not say that Jesus is a rebel, nor would I say that this is a revolution. I would call it an uprising of learning, an uprising of hope. So I was struck by that. Was an inspiring twist for me to think it's not a rebel, it's not a revolution, both of which I tend to see Jesus as a rebel. I see Jesus as a revolutionary. I see what he was doing was turning the empire upside down in a significant way. That's why he was crucified. But what Brian McLaren says, no, don't think of it as a rebellion or a revolution. Think of it as an uprising of hope, an uprising of peace, an uprising of generosity, an uprising in a positive way. So that struck me. So the question then goes to each of the two of you, and whichever would like to speak first is fine. The question is, what thought in today's lesson especially provoked you or disturbed you, or what did you catch that you really need to put out on the table for us to talk about?
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I have 2 things that I thought about. I had a lot of thoughts with this chapter. The pardoning power of God. And I know that's probably coming later, but then the fact today that you talked about the fact that we have that power. Sometimes when we go to forgive somebody, we sort of gulp. Like, I don't know if I can do this or not. It doesn't mean we have to like whatever behavior we found offensive, but we have to forgive it, and we have to forgive the person. And if we are to follow the gospel, no one has to do anything, but you can choose to. And the pardoning power of God is what God hopes we'll find ourselves filled with, is that power to forgive. And then the idea that we're powerful people when we can do that we have the power to do. And
Well, thank you for bringing that up, because in my opinion, that's one of the harder things that we are trying to do. Forgive someone. A wrong has to have taken place. There's something that sticks in your craw. There's something that's just under your skin. It's, I don't want to let that person off, or I want them to learn a lesson, or they should see what it feels like themselves. There's all kinds of that rancor that comes up. To forgive someone is to say, I welcome you back into my life. You haven't earned it, you didn't deserve it, but I'm allowing that pain and resentment and struggle to be set aside. Very hard to do. And I think one of the things that was happening in that story is that the scribes who said, only God can forgive, we can't forgive, you can't forgive, only God can forgive, that takes that onus off us. We don't have to. I can continue to carry my resentment, my grudge, my trouble with you to the dying day, because God is going to be the one that decides between us. It's like, yeah, but then your whole life got sucked down into that same bleak toxin. So the notion that the pardoning power that God has is being given to us, to you and to me.
I think there are three things that came to my mind. One of them is sometimes I see things that other people may think are trivial, but Jesus has a home.
Oh, the house is being ripped up.
The house is being ripped up. And what I find about that is we often think of Jesus as the Son of God and forget that when Jesus was Jesus, before the crucifixion and resurrection, most people saw him like I would see you or someone else. I mean, maybe a wise teacher, maybe a healer, but nobody walked around and says, well, this is God's son. You find nothing about the virgin birth after the first 2 chapters of Luke. And so it's hard sometimes to put ourselves in the mind that Jesus had brothers and sisters. We know the names of Jesus' brothers. We know he had sisters. How many, we're not sure. And he had a mother, he had a father. When other people looked at him, they saw Jesus bar Joseph, Jesus the son of Joseph.
Can I just add that in the story it says Mary explains that the rabbi inside is the son of a tradesman from Nazareth.
Yeah.
That's how she
And
describes it.
it's like, and so when you're hearing saying your sins are forgiven, we hear Jesus the Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, the anointed one. But we have to put ourselves in the mindset of saying, no, this is Jesus walking. That's what I don't like sometimes about movies. It's like Jesus never gets his feet dirty. His robe is always white, but he was he was a man, fully human.
Man of Nazareth, a Galilean.
The other thing that struck me is the recurrence of the sense of forgiveness. And I keep thinking what Paul Tillich said when he said that the most difficult thing to do is to forgive yourself. And so while I was looking at this, we may have trouble forgiving you, and like you were saying, but to think yourself as being forgiven, to forgive yourself, and to allow somebody else to say to you, God forgives you. That takes a humility and a sense of allowing God's grace to flow in your own life, rather than saying, I know I'm really not worthy. I can tell you all sorts of things that I probably wish you wouldn't know. We all carry things like that. And then the third thing is that, what do they call it, prevenient grace? Is that the word? That God's forgiveness is there before our asking for it. That we often say, well, you can't be forgiven because you didn't ask to be forgiven. Well, what would happen if you were forgiven before you asked? And when you find out that you're forgiven, what an excitement that is that you were forgiven before you asked. I don't know if that makes sense, but the sense that I don't have to get on my knees and beg for God's forgiveness. God's whole coming to us in Jesus is to say, I love you, I honor you, as Isaiah said, you're precious. I'm waiting to forgive you.
That we are not converting God to begin to think differently about us, away from wrath and into benevolence.
Yeah. God's going to forgive me.
God says, I know you, I love you, I made you. I've walked that whole way. You've gotten in that pit. Who do you think is sitting in that pit with you, hoping that we're going to get out together?
Yeah.
So that sense of presence. One of the things in the story, again, it didn't go so much in the chapter, but the image of people tearing off the roof of the house while people are sitting there having a Bible study. And then this person comes down, and Jesus sees the faith of those 4 friends who ripped off the roof. And he sees their faith and forgives the paralytic. And he didn't see faith in the paralytic. Mm-hmm. Now, the paralytic allowed himself to be, well, what's a paralytic going to do anyway? But he saw the faith of the friends who believed that if we can get him to Jesus, Jesus can make a difference here. And that in itself, kind of remote control, became, you, son, your sins are forgiven. When they said that too, it strikes me that he's forgiving the people that ripped up the roof of his house
Yeah.
without going to the property committee to get reimbursement. So there's a lot of forgiveness happening in there that we sort of blow over when we think, well, Son of God, of course he has to forgive because that's who he is. No, this is a person whose house just got ripped up, who's been interrupted in a brutal kind of way with somebody, he's teaching a lesson and somebody drops down from the roof and says, son, not his son, but son, intimate language, your sins are forgiven. Wow, he didn't ask for it, he didn't deserve it, but it's there. And I think that's what you're talking about, that grace that is already, the forgiveness is already there before anything. And that's a great image of God to have.
The title held for me a thought that came first, which was the real, and what makes something real. I sniffed around as an agnostic around the corners of this church for many years before I became convicted, and I had a conversion experience. I was sniffing around, wanting to experience God, but it wasn't happening until I had a conversion experience. And so the word myth has always, and I want to explain to the viewers, so that you don't immediately think of it as just a story or just a fairy tale. The thing that a myth, the best definition I ever heard, writer Gertrude Mueller Nelson, her 8-year-old daughter was asked at school what kind of books did their parents read them. And she said, well, my father reads me Shakespeare. The teacher was taken aback. And she said, and my mother reads me myths. And the teacher said, well, what's a myth? She said, she thought, well, it's something that's not necessarily true on the outside, but it's true on the inside.
Yeah, very nice.
And that's the best definition I ever heard. So, and I don't mean to confront anyone with this word as a choice, but it was for me. And it's what I explained to my children, who only one is churched. And all the rest say, I feel spiritual, Mom. I feel lots of things, but I don't care about organized religion. And I said, well, there may come a time when you do. But until then, just know that Christianity is my myth. It's a myth I choose to believe because I experienced the gospel at some point, and that became for me real. And it was a myth that explained to me what my faith is all about. And so for my time and place and experience in my culture, I may have been somewhere else and become Hindu or Buddhist or whatever in that culture. Instead, I became Christian, and I choose to believe that myth. Now, do I believe it every day as strongly as another day? Well, I can't much go back to when I didn't believe. That doesn't happen anymore. But yeah, some days it's an up and down journey, and some days it's a little more difficult to climb up that hill. But it's still my myth, and it's what I believe.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, and you just touched on it also. When you talked about the 4 people lowering them down, that's a definition of the church, or one of the definitions of the church. And what you were saying about can you believe is that there are times when prayer comes easily, and there are times when I can't pray for whatever reason. I bet you everyone out there can think of some reason why it just isn't there. Well, you pray for me when I can't, and I pray for you when I can't. I lower you down through the roof when you can't. You lower me down through the roof when I can't. It isn't just I, it's we. And one of the things the church does is say, okay, it isn't a smooth road. And you know, when my parents died and I was struggling with their death and things like that, and gee, I'm not sure I believe that. What's going on? the church surrounded me and believed for me. But also when somebody else was struggling, the church gathered around them and believed for them. And so it's a joint, it's very lonesome when it's just you. And the church provides that surrounding fellowship. Now, it does a lot more than that, but I think that's an important thing that it does.
I think it's also, when you brought that up, we often think of Jesus and his followers as the disciples or the apostles. There's the church moving around. But in reality, it's wherever those four faithful friends are trying to do something on behalf of the other. The church is there too. The action has already shown. And so he says, your faith, I see your faith has made you well. You are forgiven. All that language is not disciples, it's outsiders. It's people who are acting out
Which
in
could be one of
reality.
your sons that doesn't go to church, but
Yeah.
feels spiritual. Like I have a couple of
I
children.
want to throw in something else that struck me as you were talking about myth, and sometimes it ebbs and flows. Sometimes you have a lot, sometimes you're farther away. I think we have a problem with the word Christian in this particular culture. There's too many people that treat it like it's a noun. And a noun is a category of a person, place, or thing. And once you click in, it's like on a census, what are you? Are you Buddhist or are you Christian? And say, okay, I'm this category of person. Well, in reality, it's an adverb. Christian is a quality of our behavior, of our actions. So some days you may be more Christian than others. Some days you may feel more Christian than others because it's an attitude connected to our verbs. And I think too many people think it's enough to say, okay, I'm Christian, I believe a certain set of doctrines, I've got that, I wrote it down in my Bible the day I thought that, and now I'm Christian and nothing's going to ever say, no, you're being Christian is a part of your behavior. And I can look and see, are you being Christian or not? In this when you treated that person this way, when you're raising this issue, when you were dealing with that thing, were you being Christian? See, being Christian isn't the same as being a Christian.
And there,
Oh, no, go ahead, I'm sorry.
there are like 45,000 different denominations of Christian too.
If
And
you count the 39,000 that are non-denominational.
yeah, that are storefront, that are, that tells you how many differences there can be in that word. And I don't want to be claimed by all Christians that I perceive. Everybody has to find their way, and unless you experience it, it's never going to be real.
You just said it. The earliest name for the church and for the Christians were people of the way.
Yep.
The followers of Jesus. It wasn't Christian, it was the people of the way. And I think one of the things that happens is you may find out you were Christian when you thought you weren't.
You were being a
You
Christian.
were being a Christian, you were doing God's will, you were being forgiving, you were loving. Now, I always think you got to be very careful, and if somebody says they're not a Christian, you say, well, you're sure acting like one, and then say
Yeah.
you are a Christian. I mean, you have to give the integrity of the individual and your own integrity. You just can't go around and say, well, everybody who does something good is a Christian. I mean, you
No,
could.
that's not true.
But you see, even in your language though, is a Christian. See, when you do that, that's the problem.
That's
You can say you're being Christian, but if you're saying you're being a Christian, then you've moved it into the noun.
That's right.
You've moved it into the category.
That's true.
And the categorical is where it's all screwed up,
Yeah,
in my opinion.
And that's where we get mixed up. I am the way, the truth, and the life. People say, well, okay, if you believe in Jesus, that's the way, the truth. No, it's following Jesus. If you follow Jesus, Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. And it isn't just an intellectual thing, it's a walk, it's a way. And so I keep going back to one passage. You may have the faith to move mountains, but if you do not have love, you have nothing at all. If faith is just belief, then we have to be careful with that word too. But if faith is just an intellectual assent, then you can have an intellectual assent and be completely away from the way. That's what Paul says. You can have faith to move mountains, but if you don't have love, you haven't got anything at all. That's a powerful statement.
I want to say one more thing about the conversion experience I had. Wasn't anything I ever desired. I didn't want to be laid flat on the floor. But that's when it came. Is when I finally just said I can't do it myself. But the first thing I felt was that I had been forgiven. That was my very first, getting back to the forgiveness part. The second thing was that I could now forgive. And I mean really forgive. So those two things were key in the belief system.
Your personal
My
experience.
experience of God was that the Spirit forgave me.
That you're set free. You are a new
was.
person. Today is the first day of the rest of your life, and I'm with you, and I love you, and you're
And I'm
mine.
rooting for you, as
I'm on
Red
your
Green
side.
would say.
I got your back.
And I think it's important to say just the opposite of what you said. And that is that there are a lot of Christians who have never had a conversion experience.
That's right.
I mean, that one particular moment where they said, okay, on that day, I was knocked off my donkey or whatever happened, and I became Christian, and I can point to it. I've never had one of those experiences. But if you understand faith as trust, I trust. It isn't. I do have faith, even though I've never had that great experience. But I've had all sorts of mini where I felt great love from somebody, and I've looked at someone and said, "Wow, I can just see God's love there," and so I trust that that's the way to live, and that really looks like it's the healing way, without necessarily having had it. So I think it's important where some people say, unless you accept Jesus Christ at this time, at this place, you're not a Christian. A lot of people come to Christianity. Well, who was it? The great congregational educational scholar said, way back in the 1800s, said, I pray that you never know a time that you're not a Christian. In other words, you're so inculcated and bred in the church that it flows through you, and you don't have a particular moment. It's just I never thought.
I'm with you entirely that trusting God is what faith is about, in my opinion. And in the Bible, in the Gospels, actually one is in the Acts, there are two people who had to be knocked off their high horse and started over from scratch. One of them was turnaround Apostle Paul. Saul of Tarsus was going the wrong way, wrong attitudes, wrong everything, biblically strong. I mean, he was a Pharisee among all Pharisees. He was a great Bible teacher.
Great faith to move mountains.
Well, the thing is, but he didn't have love. And when he got to get knocked off his high horse, knock him down, turn him around, blind him, get the whole thing right. And that becomes a model. He thinks, well, probably everybody have to go what I had to go through. No, you had to go through it. If you read he was absolutely in the wrong place. The second one is Nicodemus. Sanhedrin, major mover and shaker, a teacher he had clergy credentials out the wazoo. And he had to start over because he didn't get it, that the Spirit moves like the wind and that it can blow through and you don't see how it's happening. He doesn't realize that thing. So two people had to be born again in the Gospels. Unfortunately, there are some traditions that say, well, if it had to happen to Nicodemus and it had to happen to Apostle Paul, it has to happen to Bob and to Ginny and to Paul, to everybody. It's like, no, where'd you come up with that? Thousands of people in the Gospels are not having to have that, knock them down, turn them around, get them started from scratch. Thousands. How can you miss all of them in order to focus on two? Wait, like anybody who reads the book knows that, except that somehow we don't hear
How about
that.
those people, those four people again, Lori?
Yes.
And as you said, the person being healed.
The
didn't say-
paralytic, yeah.
The paralytic didn't say, oh, by the way, I have faith too. It's the fact.
See, I think the way he showed his faith was he got up when Jesus said, get up and walk.
Yeah.
He could say, it's like, no, I'm paralyzed. That's why they dropped me down here. I'm not going to move. See,
Yeah.
he could have stopped right there. But the act of getting up showed, I guess I'm taking it seriously. I trust that what he said is true.
Yeah.
And all the way through, you see people acting in trust on what they said or what they felt was true, and their whole world changed. They came up a new person. That, to me, is the gospel. That's how Jesus made it real for thousands of people in the Gospels, apart from after the resurrection, the Apostle Paul, or during his ministry with Nicodemus.
The last thing in the book I think that was a key was that the kingdom is not a place.
Mhm.
The kingdom is
In
you.
and among us. The
Yeah.
kingdom is in those four guys on the roof.
Yep.
Even though everybody's saying, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
We're not insured against that. Doesn't matter. It's still the right thing to do.
Yep.
There's one thing it suggests also in the back of his chapter. He says, when you meditate, sit in silence with Jesus' words. Your faith has made you well. What in you feels like it's being made well? And again, this is not that categorical, I believe, therefore I become a Christian, but rather in your daily life. In what way is Jesus' presence with you saying it's your faith that's making you well? So what is it?
Now, one of the great passages, I think, of Scripture is when by the pool, when the paralytic reaches out and says, I want to be healed. And Jesus looks at him and says, do you want to be made well? And we often don't ask that question because a lot of times we don't want to be made well because we have learned to live with who we are, and we've learned to use whatever our brokenness is to manipulate people or to even manipulate ourselves. And I've known people, for example, that I've called on in hospitals, and they literally don't want to get well because they have learned to have other people care for them, and they're afraid if they get well,
They're responsible.
They're responsible, and all of a sudden, people may not love them like they do when they're. I've actually had a doctor tell me not to call in the hospital because every time I called on the person, she got worse. Now, that sounds funny, but what he was saying is she was getting ready to get well. I would come in, other people from the church would come in. She would eat up the attention, and she would actually get worse. And so that sounds funny, but and I suppose it is. But you know what I'm trying to say is that do you want to be made well? If Jesus is helping make you well, do you want to be well? Or I've learned to live with my doubt, and I kind of live out of my doubt, and my doubt is who I am, and I like you thinking I'm struggling with doubt. So Jesus, I don't want you. Leave me alone.
Well, I think the two things come to mind. One is the man in the story that we were talking about today was paralyzed. He was stuck. He was immobile. And I think that is a myth of deep proportion in many of our lives. There's places where we are stuck. Yes. And we're stuck because we don't want to move forward. We're afraid of moving forward, or we've become so habitual. We are stuck. We are paralyzed. And this thing, you are forgiven. You are free. You are a new person. Get up and start moving. You have to act. You have to act in trust. You have to act that that's going to happen. You have to take the risk of getting up, and your whole world is different. The second thing is, it was in the closing remarks in his chapter, and I know we're pretty much out of time, so I just want to say, Mary, he puts the words in Mary Magdalene. He says, the reality is, if you change things here, and you change them here, then you change all of this. And she indicated the world around her. Mm-hmm. If you change the way that you think and change the way that you feel, you make your changes here, then all of a sudden everything around you starts to change.
And for some people that's, oh my gosh, it's instantaneous. And for other people it is a journey that takes place every day, a little bit at a time.
Or as I said about the Pharisees and scribes, the ones that were saying, you cannot forgive, only God can forgive. Human beings cannot forgive, it's not allowed. They could have forgiven. They had the power to forgive. They just were refusing to do it. They could have if they would have, but they wouldn't. And that's why the sticking was they wouldn't think. Sorry, we're going to have to stop. You'll have to come back again on another occasion.
Well, I'm not going to be able to, but that's okay.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So glad that you're with us again for chapter 26. Jesus makes it real.